What's going on, everybody? As some of you have seen, I've been posting videos to the channel again after being gone for quite some time, but a lot of those videos have been podcasts, and so I figured if I'm going to be posting videos anyway, I might as well do an update on some of the books that I've been reading while I've been away, since I think I posted maybe one video last year. And so for today's video, I'm going to be talking about the best books I read in 2018. Now, previously on the channel, I did a best books of 2017 and best books of 2016, and in both of those videos, I did a numbered list. But for this year, I'm going to do away with that because I read so many spectacular novels that I couldn't imagine putting some of them above some of the others, and so it's just going to be a general grouping of a lot of those amazing books that I read last year, and I hope you enjoy the list. With all that being said, let's get started. First up, we have Mother Night by Kurt Vonnegut. Look at that guy. Published in 1962, this book is narrated by Howard W. Campbell Jr., who is an American by birth, a Nazi by reputation, and a nationless person by inclination, who we find in a jail in Israel as a Nazi war criminal. Brought into the war as an American spy, Howard narrates one of the most prime examples of gray morals I've ever read to date. Howard was an effective Nazi propagandist, but he was also sending out coded messages to the Americans to few people's knowledge, including oftentimes his own. And so that creates a really interesting dichotomy to Howard's character, because though he is helping a really terrible entity in the war, he's also helping the Americans to defeat that evil entity. So that brings up, if you're an effective player for both sides of opposing values, does that cancel out your sins? After finishing this book, I'm not quite sure. This was definitely top tier Vonnegut. Next, I have a Kindle placeholder for The Razor's Edge by W. Somerset Maugham. Incidentally, my Kindle is totally out of batteries because I have not been reading on my Kindle at all. It's been physical books or audiobooks in the last year or so. I actually originally listened to this one as an audiobook earlier this year, and it was kind of weird how I came about this novel here. I have this book mug where there's a bunch of spines that wrap around the whole thing, and essentially it's the mug creator's favorite books, and on that mug, I found this one here, and for some reason, I find motivation in these weird reading goals, and so one of them is to read all the books on the mug, and so I had to pick this one up, but I had no idea what it was about. This story follows an American named Larry and his journey toward enlightenment through the eyes of a writer who knows Larry through some secondary parties. That writer is technically supposed to be W. Somerset Maugham, and you can take from that what you will. It's supposed to be loosely based, but regardless, it is a very compelling way to tell this story. Larry fights in World War I at the beginning of his journey and is profoundly changed by the death of a fellow soldier during that fight, and comes home a completely changed man. Once he makes it back to the States, he begins to ponder the meaning of life and decides to use the money that he's earned from serving in the military to loaf about and chase enlightenment. As Larry travels the world, he pops in and out of the lives of a lot of the people that he knew before, serving as a big contrast to their more materialistic desires. It was interesting to read this book after exploring some of the writings of the Beat generation in 2017, most notably with the Dharma Bums, because they both have this mixing of Eastern and Western philosophy. In my opinion, the implementation of Eastern philosophy was done in a much more sophisticated way in The Razor's Edge, and I feel like there was a lot more to admire in Larry's commitment to those practices as opposed to Ray Smith and the Dharma Bums, but I would definitely recommend reading both of them and making that decision for yourself. It's interesting to note the publishing year of this novel, which is 1944, because that meant that it was written smack dab in the middle of World War II, but it's revisiting a lot of these hardships from the last 30 years or so, most notably with World War I and the Great Depression, and these events really affect a lot of the characters in this story, and I think that seeing a writer who's in the middle of this next big event that a lot of us can't fathom because we weren't around for it, I think it's quite a powerful thing, and it seems like it resonated a lot more with audiences at that time. I don't feel like I've seen as much discussion of Somerset Maugham or this book, even though I know there have been movie adaptations in the past. But it certainly makes sense that it would have resonated a lot more with people that were really immersed in that life back then. That being said, it's well worth a read today, especially if you like historical fiction. I felt that it did touch on a lot of these situations in a really unique way because a lot of it takes place in other areas of the world, and so you get these different perspectives from characters that are Americans but are kind of removed from the economic troubles of their home country, but everybody's still feeling it all the same. So if any of that sounds interesting, I definitely recommend picking it up. Next up, we have Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. I have nearly 2 hours of content about this book on my channel already in the form of podcasts. I actually started a podcast with my wife and our friend, and it's been a lot of fun. So if you want to get more in depth to that book, you can check out 2 of the episodes that we have on that. We do about 2 per book, and so we do a little bit more of a deep dive there. But long story short, this was a deeply layered emotional powerhouse of a novel, and you'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll be glad you read this one. And so again, if you are interested, definitely check that out. There are some spoilers, so I would recommend reading about halfway through the book before the first episode, but it's well worth your time. Not only that, but Lincoln the Bardo was a debut novel, so if you're interested in seeing how a short story writer makes the transition into the novel format, this one is just an incredible transition, so check it out for that as well. Next up, we have Been Down So Long It Looks Like Up to Me by Richard Farina. Speaking of debut novels, this was Richard Farina's first and only novel before his untimely death, just a few days after the publication of this one in 1966. This novel is a pillar of 1960s counterculture and features a cast of cool college kids, and it features a mysterious character named Knossos. Now, part of this novel is based upon true events that took place at Cornell University in the 1950s due to curfews that were implemented at the boys' and girls' dorms. And most of this novel documents the drug-taking and free love mentality of the late 50s and early 60s that took place in certain pockets of America and puts them on steroids. Despite the perceived cool factor of the main character with his hip talk and the infectious charisma, he's not without his faults, and many of the dubious moral dilemmas that present themselves as the novel rolls on really keeps the story interesting. And so, it'll really spark some debates on the merits of the countercultural movement, because in certain instances it does seem like an ideal lifestyle. A lot of these kids really felt like they found enlightenment through a lot of these activities, but there were definitely negatives to that lifestyle as well. So if you're interested in that, check out this novel. I wouldn't say it's for everybody, but if you're especially interested in the countercultural movements of mid-century America, this is a great one to check out. Next up, we have Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. So speaking of Richard Farina, this book was actually dedicated to the cult hero by his old friend Tom. Yes, I tackled this novel this year, and it was as challenging and strange and confusing as its reputation suggested, but it was also one of the most amazing and rewarding reads I have ever experienced. What struck me in reading Gravity's Rainbow is that my confusion dissipated if I just continued to put one foot in front of the other. A lot of plot points that at first glance seem to make no sense find a resolution 50 pages later, 60 pages later, 70 pages later, and sometimes even all the way to the end of the novel in a few notable instances. But I just think that if you continue to make that journey, you will be rewarded tenfold. In other words, you won't be left hanging if you just pay attention and just keep moving. I personally took notes, and it enhanced my reading experience so much, especially in those cases where there were repeated instances of certain themes and motifs. A lot of times they happen, just over the course of this random sentence in the middle of a page. But if you continue to pay attention to all of these references that keep coming up over and over and over, you start to gain a lot of insight into what the novel's really trying to get across. And so maybe notes would be the way to go. I know there's also a companion piece. I did not use that this time, but again, just paying attention is really important, because you'll pick up on some of these other themes that will keep you going when the plot has seemingly thrown you overboard. Some of the interesting things that kept coming up over and over were the reversal of cause and effect. This is most notably used with the V2 rocket, where it strikes first and then you hear it. And that's really a central part of the novel with that plot point right there. But then you see that reversal continue to happen, and it gets, spelled out pretty explicitly. And it really adds to the chaos of the novel because it's not anything that humans are used to. There's a lot of scientific study on cause and effect, most notably with Pavlov, and when that gets reversed, all hell breaks loose. There's also a deep exploration into paranoia here, as there is in most of Pynchon's novels, but there's also a look into the horrors of war, where a lot of these characters are affected by the powers that be and what they stand to gain from this worldwide conflict. Because oftentimes in war, somebody's profiting. There has to be somebody producing this new technology to help certain countries gain the upper hand, and a lot of times that's a nationless person. It's just somebody that wants more money, more influence. And so looking into that here, I think that it's a very interesting way to look at World War II, because oftentimes a lot of stories take the good versus evil approach, as I previously mentioned with Mother Night by Kurt Vonnegut. You look at these different moral dilemmas, but here it's just there's this overarching evil in money and power. And so I think that is a fascinating part of this book, and you'll really start to feel that paranoia as you go along. I also loved the zone here. There's a whole section that looks into the battle-torn areas of the war as the war starts to wind down. Again, in a lot of other stories, you see it from a big picture standpoint where these world leaders have certain things to gain. There are certain treaties, there are certain reparations that have to be paid, but a lot of times there are people there on the battlefields that their lives were torn apart, and after war, it's just a lawless zone. And it's just funny to see how a lot of these characters really embrace this new lawlessness and how some just feel completely lost. And I think that perspective is really fresh and really unique, and not something that I think I've seen in really any World War II stories. And so the zone is what makes this unique. It may seem like it's just a World War II story, but to me it's a lot more than that. And if you're intimidated by this book, at least read the first section. It won't take you that long. I think that there's a lot of forward movement at the beginning and a lot that's easy to grasp onto. You immediately get this horrific war setting, but also this really comedic scene as well with this really famous breakfast. And so read through that to at least get an idea of the style of this book, because it is very influential. Obviously, a lot of people know Pynchon for this novel. I would say it's his most famous, but maybe not most read, but I think you'll get a lot from that alone, and maybe that'll be motivation enough to keep that progress going. So check out that first section or check out the whole thing, but regardless, Gravity's Rainbow is a masterpiece. Next, we have Meet Me in the Bathroom by Lizzy Goodman. This was actually the last book I read this year, and it was something that was very near and dear to me. That title is taken from a lyric from one of the songs on the Strokes' second album, Room on Fire. Meet me in the bathroom, that's what she said, I don't mind, it's true. And this book explores the New York rock scene from 2001 to 2011. Technically, it does go a little bit before that, just to show how barren the music scene was in New York prior to the Strokes' explosion onto the scene. But it's really crazy to read this and see how many bands that were part of this indie rock explosion of the aughts all started in this one central location, and they really didn't have as much in common as you would think, except for experiencing a city during a point in time where there was a lot of cultural change. One of those factors being the widespread adoption of the internet, which changed the music industry forever, and the other factor being 9/11. When there's all of these bands that are in New York during this time period, obviously they're going to be affected by this completely insane event in the city that they live in. I'd say for that reason alone, it is worth reading. You're getting a really human experience here. You know, a lot of people have these memories of 9/11, but not a lot of people were actually there. But you're getting these stories from people that were there on that day and then were continuing to live their lives afterward. And so I found that to be a really fascinating thing. But you know, there's also the whole other aspect where you're getting introduced to a lot of incredible music. There was obviously an energy that was there, and it might have been because of poor circumstances, and it might have been because the circumstances might have been just right, but there was obviously something going on that had this creative boom. And on Goodreads, I talked about this, but I think there are a lot of cultural golden ages in these various places around the world. It just doesn't seem as significant because we've been so inundated with culture, especially with the internet, but just in modern times and modern media, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's shoved down our throats, but that doesn't change the fact that there are significant periods of creativity all the time. Add the fact that at any given point you can have a fantastic soundtrack while reading this just by getting on Spotify and downloading any of the albums that are mentioned here. You know, you have a reading experience like no other. When anybody's talking about the creation of such and such album, you can throw it on because of the internet now. And it's just funny to see them talking about really the beginning of all of that with Napster and whatnot. And now we just have all of the music at our fingertips, quite legally, though, for a small fee. But you can listen to all of this music and experience that creative boom for yourself. And lastly, we have Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon. Just like with Lincoln and the Bardo, I already have a whole video on this. It was actually the one video that I posted last year that wasn't a podcast. So if you want some more in-depth thoughts, definitely check out that review. But again, it's another just masterclass piece of work by Thomas Pynchon. I think after this year, I just have 2 more novels to go and 1 short story collection of his before I've read all of his works. And I really do think that once I finish all of those, I'll do a ranking video just to see where they place, which I think that'll be hard. Those 2 books were part of the reason why I didn't do a ranking for this video. So I'll just save it for that, add some suspense there. But I found that I really love Pynchon's work. I think that he is just an incredible writer. And if you haven't picked up any of his stuff, give it a shot. It's certainly not for everybody, but if it is for you, it's really for you. And that's about it, the best books that I read in 2018. Like I said, I have been posting videos again more recently. It seems as though they will be mostly podcasts. We have a book club. I think that it's something that if you're planning on reading any of the books that we're planning on reading, it would be a great activity to get involved in. We are finishing up Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and we'll be reading 100 Years of Solitude next. And if you follow along, we'll be talking about some more of the books that we'll be discussing in that book club podcast. So just keep your eye out for that, and we'll see what more videos come out this year, but it is good to be back, and I hope you got some good suggestions from the video today. Thank you very much. Catch you next time.